we're seeing women and girls who are most vulnerable coming from poor families, sometimes from families with single parents or broken families. We're also seeing women and girls who are migrant workers.
We'll come back to that conversation in just a moment. This is Asia Now, the podcast featuring stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. Human trafficking is a term thrown around quite a bit in the media, but what just does it encompass and how bad are things? That's today's conversation taking place in Asia now. Hello everyone, welcome to this week's edition of Asia Now. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and it's my pleasure to spend just a little bit of time with you, so thank you so much for joining me. Now, not too long ago, I was watching CNN, and they had a story from their CNN Freedom Project. It was about a 14-year-old young woman who's actually been trafficked since she was the age of 12. But that term, trafficking, human trafficking, it's a very clean, almost surgical way to address things. That's why today on Asia Now, we're going to talk about it frankly. We're going to talk about it openly. And for that, I'm welcoming back to the podcast Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. To begin our conversation, human trafficking is a term used in the media to reflect a whole number of different kinds of situations. I was wondering if you could, what is the best definition so we can get a good framework to understand exactly what we're talking about?
Well, it's a good question to ask. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what human trafficking is. Oftentimes this is skewed by the media or by other observers to mean various different things. But there is an international legal definition. This is in the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. It's part of the supplements the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and commonly known as the Palermo Protocol. And the specific definition, which was the result of extended international negotiations, states that trafficking in persons shall mean the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, of fraud, of deception, or abuse of power, of a position of vulnerability, or of giving or receiving payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. As you can see, this is a phrase that the international lawyers worked long and hard at. It was the result of significant ongoing negotiations for several years before they finally came up with a definition that was acceptable to most, although perhaps not supported by all. And that is the core definition of human trafficking.
Recently, there have been a number of high-profile reports in the media talking situations akin to modern-day slavery. We have that situation in South Korea with the salt farming, fishing in Indonesia and Thailand. Are these typical examples of human trafficking in Asia? I mean, what's the worst we've seen?
Well, these are some of the big story labor rights, exploitation, human trafficking cases that have been prominently reported in the media. And I think, for instance, having a person working 22 hours on a fishing boat in Indonesian waters, being beaten, abused, whipped with stingray tails, threatened with death by captains is pretty bad. I mean, it's hard to imagine a situation that's worse than that. But then when you look around, there are lots of those situations. There are situations that remain hidden. For instance, migrant domestic workers who are held against their will, forced to work in households maybe as many as 20, 22 hours, in some cases sexually abused, physically abused for sure. I mean, these are cases of human trafficking that no one really hears about. So there's a wide gamut of exploitation that is taking place. It ranges for all sorts of human endeavor. We're seeing cases of child labor, people being forced to labor in brick kilns in India. We see situations of women trafficked into sexual exploitation in places like Malaysia. Everywhere you turn, you can find exploitation, and you can find people being abused being held against their will, essentially lost to their family and relatives who oftentimes sent them abroad hoping that they would be a major breadwinner and support the family.
On that note, about how many people in Asia are affected by human trafficking?
Well, Human Rights Watch doesn't actually have an estimate for the number of persons trafficked in Asia. We've resisted having such a figure, frankly, because it's hard to have an empirical basis for it. However, other organizations have been less reticent in estimating numbers, and the ILO, for instance, in 2012, came up with a figure saying that they thought that there were 21 million people around the world who are victims of forced labor. And they said that, in fact, 56% of those were in the Asia-Pacific region.
If we turn our attention to the sex trade, what sector of the population is ensnared most by its despicable web?
Well, I mean, first of all, people being duped into situations where they're held against their will and in sexual enslavement can occur to anybody. But we're seeing women and girls who are most vulnerable coming from poor families, sometimes from families with single parents or broken families. We're also seeing women and girls who are migrant workers, people from neighboring countries, for instance, like in Thailand, women coming from Cambodia, from Laos, or from Burma. So those are, the vulnerable groups that we see most likely to end up in human trafficking situations involving sexual exploitation.
And what are we seeing now? Are we seeing any increases or decreases in human trafficking? Is it skewing towards one sector of the population?
Well, I think there's broader awareness that's been built about human trafficking in the region. I think that there's more awareness amongst youth about the dangers that exist. But we haven't seen any sort of significant decrease in the human trafficking in Asia Pacific. If anything, it has remained largely impervious to any sort of efforts to reduce it. I think that the situation with human trafficking, as we look back over the past decade or so, is one where the situation continues to be bad, and it has not significantly improved in any major way.
Now, you mentioned that there's a growing increase in awareness, but people are still, as you put it a few moments ago, being duped into certain bait and switch type situations. What kind of techniques are people involved in trafficking employing to try and get people into this horrific situation?
Well, there's a lot of duping, often connected to job offers and employment. This reflects the fact that in many countries in the region, there's difficulty in finding good, decent work that provides adequate remuneration for people. There are many more youth seeking jobs than there are those good jobs. Especially youth without a high-level education. So people who are have limits in terms of the sort of work that they may be able to do or may be able to get. And so the promises of good job, particularly connected to migration, that, if you go to another country, you can get a better job and send money back. That takes people away from networks of relatives and community. It makes them more vulnerable. They may not know the language. They may not have any way to outreach to people in case they get into trouble or being exploited. So the duping connected to migration is a major problem. I'll give you an example of the trafficking of men onto Thai fishing boats. Oftentimes these schemes are only as complicated as they need to be to deliver someone into that exploitation. So cases of men in Cambodia, poor farmers, are offered jobs working in factories or in plantations or, for instance, farms, raising animals, are encouraged by the brokers to go to Thailand, to cross the border, to take up a job, often with a fairly lucrative offer compared to what they're earning in Cambodia. But instead of being taken to that land-based employment, they're taken to a fishing pier, they're controlled by a gang, and they're forced onto a fishing boat.
So that brings about the question, what's being done to curb human trafficking?
Well, there's not nearly enough. I mean, I think that there is a focus on trying to help victims of human trafficking when they're identified, to allow them to return safely home and to provide necessary services to them. There's been some countries like Thailand that have been leaders in this manner. But I think that there's not a lot being done of cross-border assistance and cross-border collaboration between law enforcement. Issues of police working together to ensure that, for instance, a Cambodian who's trafficked to Thailand, that person could be facilitated returned back to Cambodia, but also that there could be some sort of prosecution with the two police forces and attorney generals sharing evidence. It just doesn't happen.
Is that going to be enough, or does more need to happen?
Well, I think what you need to have is you have some high-profile prosecutions, instances where people are made aware that if they engage in this kind of criminal activity, that they'll be held accountable. Right now, the dynamic is that most people get away with it. So therefore, it's very lucrative. Why not continue doing it?
And one final question as we enter into the second quarter of 2015, looking to the Asia-Pacific region, what are some of the important issues to keep an eye on?
Well, I mean, every year there's the U.S. government's Trafficking in Persons report. This is one which classifies different governments according to the efforts they're seeing being attempting or doing actually to prevent human trafficking or to prosecute people who are human traffickers. Obviously, that's a subjective decision by the U.S. government, but it is something that has really caught the attention of governments in Southeast Asia and South Asia. This year in Thailand was downgraded to Tier 3 last year, which is the worst tier. They are involved in a major lobbying campaign targeting the U.S. to persuade them that they've done enough to be moved out of that worst tier. Malaysia is also in that Tier 3, and I think are involved in trying to persuade the U.S. government to recognize that its efforts have been sufficient to get an upgrade to what is known as Tier 2 watch list. So I think there's a big focus on those two countries because these are countries where many migrants are traveling to. They are places where there is an acknowledged significant problem in human trafficking, and if there's any sort of trend, in terms of how the external world looks at the issue of human trafficking focused on the governments of Southeast Asia, these Thailand and Malaysia are sort of test cases. So I think that decision will be made and announced by the U.S. government in June, and I think a lot of people are going to be watching that very closely.
Phil Robertson is the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you, Steve.
Before I go, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject. Why does human trafficking persist in Asia? Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments on Facebook or Twitter. Be sure to keep up with more news in the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. You can also send a comment to the show or maybe some feedback or any questions you might have to podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. If you enjoyed today's program, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. It's absolutely free and easy to do. Just go to our website, asiannewsweekly.net, and click on the subscribe tab, or you can do it in your favorite podcast application like iTunes or Stitcher. Well, my friends, that is it for me this week. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.